So welcome everybody to chapters 4, 5, and 6, and it's very much okay if we want to go back to 1, 2, or 3 as you like. But I wanted to start first by seeing if it's really okay if there's things that you're uncomfortable with, but I wanted to see if you had overall general reactions to the work she's doing or the terms she's using. If there's anything that you'd like to talk a little bit more around, like, I'm not still sure what that means, I would appreciate that as well. But I want to kind of open the floor as we start with these chapters and with this author.
Well, I was impressed with her work, and I found it very informative, and it helped me get a better perspective on what is happening in the Hispanic community. And but I didn't get to chapter 6, but I have done the first 5.
Yeah. Thank you. Amy, I think I saw your hand ready to go.
Yeah, so there are a couple things. So first of all, I thought it was interesting when she was talking about structural sin. Because we talk so much about systemic injustices, and the way she was talking about structural sin was kind of I felt like the theological version of that.
Yeah.
And then she was quoting somebody else that when they said an atheist is someone who fails to practice justice towards the poor. But I thought that was a really profound statement. And there are a lot of people who I think would call themselves Christians who I feel do not practice justice towards the poor at all.
Yeah.
So, and this was a good thing because Tim had emailed me this question too. She was specifically quoting Gustavo Gutierrez, who is sort of known as maybe the first, he would brand himself liberation theologian. So Gutierrez is, of course, a South American theologian, and really liberation theology has this idea, and this is the important phrase, that God has what's called a preferential option for the poor. That is that it's not about side taking. That would be the way you would kind of like, you would flatten the argument, but the idea that when scales are tipped, what God wants to do is push the scales up so that there's leveling. So it's not that God likes poor people more than rich people. It's that when people are being suppressed, God is trying to push up the suppression so that there can be equality. Critics of Gutierrez say things like, well, how can you say God prefers person A over person B? That leads you to like predestination. And, one of the flaws with predestination, if you've read John Calvin, is you're predestined if you're rich, which is like subverting the whole thing, right? Because, anyway, you get that. So there's been a lot of thoughts about liberation theology, and some liberation theologians have actually, I don't want to say embraced, but have gone so far as to say that violence is justified, violent overthrows are justified, and that's where some of liberation theology has taken some nuances of like Marxism. I should really probably say Leninist Marxism, and that's tainted the brand a little bit, if you will. And one of the things that Isasi Diaz does that's really interesting, right, is that she definitely traces liberation theology, but she does this great reminder, kind of like Horace Williams does, and says like, hey, and if liberation theology is really going to do what it says, it needs to include women equally. So it's a sort of this rejoinder that we get.
Yeah, and one thing that struck me too was said that it is all rooted in relationship with God. In other words, relationship with God comes first, and then everything flows out of that.
I do really appreciate, Amy, you're calling your attention to that quote. An atheist is someone who fails to practice justice toward the poor. And it's an amazing quote, right? And she got me with a similar quote, right? That no greater love has anyone than this, It's not so much dying for someone else, but not allowing someone else to die. I thought that was just an incredible turn of phrase, particularly from a female point of view, right? In which women are often called to sacrifice themselves. It's no, don't let somebody else be lost. That I thought was really lovely. I saw your hand ready to go.
So, Mike, I'm enjoying this book very much. I'm struggling to understand part of it, and I'm eager to understand this better, because I just feel so white right now. I just want to take steps to remedy that whiteness. Yeah, I don't know. So I did not understand chapter 4. I did not understand the concept of that Spanish term. But then in chapter 5, I did understand, I think, what she's saying about kingdom and solidarity. And she still throughout talks a lot about just survival, just simple survival, which I just found very sobering.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's do a little bit of tracing. Let's do some tracing in chapter 4, if that sounds good, right? So just like Dolores Williams, albeit a little different mechanism, she says in chapter 4 that naming yourself is an ultimate act of power. Dolores Williams says naming God is an ultimate act of power, but it's interesting to say like those two could actually be really similar, right? And so she's done this act of power in naming Latinx women's experience and theology, Mujerista, right? And so that's sort of the first part that she builds on. Then she talks about commingled culture, and she uses these Spanish words that you probably remember from the 8th grade. It's basically, right, it's the plural form of mestizo and mulatto, right, which are mixed racial people, but she uses them in a way not of like skin tone, but of culture. So she's really talking in some ways about a cultural melting pot that is, and you could apply that however you want to. That could be Latinx women's experience mixed with Latinx men's experience, or with white feminism, or with Black womanism, or whatever it is, right? There's essentially this multiracial facet that is not just about race, it's about culture, right? So she says this really clearly. It's not about ethnicity. It's about culture, and how no one really can speak for themselves. That was a claim that she made in chapter 3. You never speak for yourself. You're always speaking as an embedded person, right? And that takes her to, Graciela, make sure I pronounce this right. Citidiano? No, is that not right?
I'm going to be honest, that was a word I was not familiar with. I've never, citidiano.
Oh, I did it wrong. It's cotidiano. Cotidiano.
I did not, I was not familiar with cotidiano.
Okay.
Yeah.
I looked it up on Google because I didn't speak Spanish. And the easiest translation was daily, right? And I think what she's trying to say with that is the everyday embodied experience. And she goes on to trace this out. These are things like norms and expectations, basically, of Latinx women. What does it mean today? Like, what's the daily grind if you're Latinx and female? That's how I understood the word, right? So she's trying to say that Latinx women are doing theology out of their own daily grind, which could be very different from the way Latinx men do it.
Now, I interpreted that not as everyday grind, but as everyday life.
Good. Yeah, no, sure. I'm trying to use that interchangeably. Sorry. We on the outside might look at it that as the grind. I'm sorry. I was just trying to use a familiar phrase. But I think you got it, Tim. So what does it mean to be a Latinx woman? It means doing things like survival, feeding and clothing your children, right? And in some ways, she's going to go on to say some of the difficult things like internalizing oppression, right? So she's going to talk about that later. Out of La Cotidiano comes self-expression, which she talks about like, hey, that informs a totally unique hermeneutic, a way of describing the world, a way of knowing. She uses the word epistemology, right? And in some ways that denounces universalisms that try to sweep Latinx women under the rug without paying attention to their everyday self-experience. So she argues, right, that all theology is fragmentary, partial, and conjectural. And what she's trying to say, I think, when she uses that term about mestize and mulates, right, is when you start to really listen to one another and include that, you have an expanded vision instead of just having tunnel vision on your own site. But part of what she's arguing, right, is that mainstream theology is not looking at la cotidiano of Latinx women. I think that's what she's doing, Lila. Does that seem fair?
That's very helpful.
So then she takes that move right to praxis. And I don't know if praxis is a familiar word to you all. We learned it in seminary. You don't see it often, and it looks like a typo, but praxis, Praxis, is both doing and thinking about doing. So it's not just practice, it's practice with reflection. And that's where she talks about, we did this last week, the difference between orthopraxy and orthodoxy. Orthopraxy includes reforming what you do and not just cognitive thinking.
Brother Mike.
Yeah, please.
I just wanted to say, and I hope this doesn't sound negative or not fitting into the discussion, but as a Hispanic woman and a woman who has walked a lot beside other Hispanics, particularly working class Hispanics. In my schools, all my kids were, and their parents were working class, which that the ladies that clean my house, I know them like sisters. Mm-hmm. They completely still focus and believe very strongly in the Catholic Church. Yeah. And all of the practices of the Catholic Church. They trust it. You know, one of the ladies that cleans the house, her daughter had a quinceañera, her 15th birthday. Mm-hmm. And they wanted to get a priest, and the priest was unavailable, was doing a wedding or something else. So they had a woman that works for the priest who is very religious, and she said a prayer and did a benediction for all of the people at the party before it started. And they continue, as I see it, to be very traditional in the masses. And the tradition of the Mass, of the communion, it's so to me, what the writer has written seems a little alien, if that makes any sense to you.
It does make sense, but it also makes me think, Graciela, that she does this really interesting turn where she says, because of all of that tradition, which has really kept women surviving in the struggle, right? Yes. It enables her to envision change, not because tradition has been so bad, but because it's given spiritual energy to people so that they can look beyond what they have. Yes. So she talks about this interesting kind of edge that we're on between keeping tradition unreformed and using tradition to nourish reform.
And I think lastly, what I'll just say is that it seemed to me that she was speaking at a very high level, like a very intellectual level that would occur amongst a group of high, I don't know, doctoral level people who were discussing what should happen or what they think is going to happen with the working class. And it it turned me off. I didn't really identify with it really at all. And I don't see the women that I've worked with in my schools and who come here and all that I've known very well throughout my life identifying with it. So I have problems. So maybe you guys can help me out because I don't understand it.
Well, I didn't know if I can be a big help, but I'll take a stab and then I'll be quiet because I'm over talking. But you know, I think what she's trying to do is she's writing this book obviously to an audience that is like her audience, I think, tends to be educated white men and women.
Yes.
I think what she's trying to say to those people, which includes most of us on the screen, to be honest, is you're not listening. So I don't think she's writing this book by and large, I don't think she's writing this book like to Latinx women. I think she's writing on their behalf to non-Latinx women, or so that Latinx women can follow the language or follow the path she's trying to pave, right?
And yeah, I guess that's where I have a trouble with it. So does it sound like I'm totally opposed to what she has said?
No, and I think what she says is really interesting. She does this in chapter 1. She says, look, I'm speaking as a Latinx woman. I'm speaking for Latinx women, but my La Cotidiano is not the cotidiano of every Latinx woman. And that's partially true, right? She's an exiled Cubano. She's an academic, I mean, at the PhD level, right? So that's not everybody's experience. And at the same time, what's interesting to me about the book, and it's interesting that you didn't, I'm actually grateful to hear that not all the Spanish that she uses has connected with you, but that's part of her voice is saying, here are these Spanish phrases, right? She talks a lot about la lucha, which I think probably is connecting for a lot of folk.
La lucha is, you know, that's la lucha de todos los días, the daily life.
Yeah.
That's real. You know, my grandmothers and the ladies I knew growing up and the women I knew and I know in the inner city. Mm-hmm. Yes, la lucha is a common phrase. It's almost like life is la lucha.
Yeah, but she says that, right? La vida es la lucha, right?
La vida es la lucha.
She's going to do this in chapter 7. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but she's going to say really interestingly, right, from my perspective, that, and this is kind of like Dolores Williams in The Wilderness, right, is that to hear that word, la lucha, does not mean like misery. Actually, people engage in la lucha when they have fiestas.
Right.
Which I think is really helpful and corrective. It's sort of like that quote I shared with you, that joy is an act of resistance. But Graciela, I want you to keep holding on to like where this doesn't fit for you and naming it. I think that's really, really helpful because I actually think she would appreciate your doing that. I don't think she's trying to speak for everybody. I think she's trying to see part of what we need to do is do a better job listening, because she says this in chapter 4, right? That when we affirm difference, actually what we're doing is having a mirror to ourselves, right? That we can expand and take a better look at what humanity means. So I appreciate it. It's always okay if you bristle against books. If we only read books we agree with, how boring would life be?
Yeah. And she's definitely highly intelligent.
Yeah.
And I think the last thing I'll comment about her is she's Cubana. Mm-hmm. And in my lifetime, Cubanas or Cubanos, you know, they're from Cuba, depending on whether they were before Castro or after Castro, or depending on whether they got caught and they had to leave and go to Florida or escape to come to the United States. They had a different perspective to me than the text. I'm going to say the Tex-Mex, the Hispanic from the United States who I'm 10th generation. I mean, we lived on the border, you know, from California, Arizona, New Mexico, and South Texas. We've been there for a long, long time. So I don't know, maybe I'm rambling, Mike, but I have trouble identifying with what she's talking about.
I think that's okay. No, I don't think you're rambling, and I think it's more than fine that you're having trouble with what she's talking about. I do. It's great. And your willingness to share your perspective means a lot.
Thank you.
You know, one of the things that has impressed me about this book, Gabriela, is that it is not written for the average Hispanic woman.
Oh,
See, it's written for people, white people that are educated or supposedly educated, or is interested in, are people who want to see things in writing or things of that sort. But I don't think that, well, you know, I don't think the average Hispanic woman, particularly those who are living in such poverty, would understand any of this, but no poor person would, no matter what culture they were in. So this is for people who are supposed to be able to understand and do something about it.
well, I've got to say something, Meg. My name is Graciela, not Gabriela, or it's Graciela.
Yeah, I thought I said Graciela.
Yeah, but it's interesting that you say that for this reason. I grew up Graciela, but in English it's Grace or Gracie. I had a lot of friends that call me Grace or Gracie, but I remember very distinctly when I reached my early 20s, I think, and I decided, no, I'm a Graciela. So I'll just tell you this so I'd be in a university class with 200 students and, you know, one of those. So they get to my name, Grazildia, Gorlilia. My last name is Barrera. So Graciela Barrera is a big mouthful.
Mm-hmm.
So my name has always been slaughtered in some way or another. And it's been funny over time, but you know, it's an outside comment from what she's talking about, but
yeah, well, I understand that because Glover gets massacred all the time. Glover, Glaga. I mean, you'd be surprised at how they can take that name. That's why when I introduce myself, I'll say my name, and then I say I glow when I'm happy and I girl when I'm not.
oh dear.
And that helps. Well, I did that with the kids when I was teaching school, so it worked.
Lila, I want to just check in and see where we are, if that was helpful with chapter 4 or if that was too much. Okay, Lila might be preoccupied. Well, I hope that was helpful to go through. And Graciela, I do really, really appreciate you talking about how this rubs against you or not. Julia asked this question in chapter 4 that I thought was really, really interesting, and it was about tradition. She raised attention to this quote: "The role of tradition is not to impose itself perennially without any changes, but make present the wisdom of generations past, which we are then called to evaluate and apply to the present in view of our need for survival, our need for liberation." And later, like on the next page, the book says our participation in the act of salvation is what we refer to as liberation. So she makes this really interesting union between liberation, like liberation theology, which is growing into your fullness as a human being, and salvation. And Julia was asking how that equation felt to everybody.
The first part, what was the first part?
Maybe I should just ask, what do you think of as salvation?
I like what, I'll just say this, I like what she said about tradition.
Mm.
That to me is very real and honest and true to me. And in my, as a Mexican American, and with the, you know, 10th generation, and the fact that I'll just say this real quickly. when I was little, I spoke Spanish before I spoke English. And I had one grandmother that said, "En esta casa no se habla inglés." In this house, all you can speak is Spanish, obviously. You can't speak English. So but yet in the public school, of course, you couldn't speak Spanish. You had to speak only English. So it was an interesting upbringing in that time of my life. And this would have been the 50s and the 60s. And I don't know if that means anything to anybody.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. Anybody willing to share what goes on in your head or in your spirit when we start talking about salvation in church, what that might mean to you? I'm very okay to start while you're thinking by saying the way I grew up hearing it was that there was eternal punishment and fiery hell for everybody who made God mad, and that salvation meant when you died, you would not go to hell and be tortured forever. That was how the word was taught to me as a kid.
Well, I don't even really think about salvation these days. What I focus on is relationship with God. Of course, salvation is included in that. But I don't know, it's been ages since I've thought about salvation because my focus is different.
Mhm.
Meg, let me ask, since you grew up Catholic and were in the convent, didn't you think or were you taught that you could go out and do almost whatever you wanted to do, but when you went to confession on Friday, all that was cleaned up? You told that and you were saved. I mean, well, I didn't think of salvation, but your soul was clean.
Mhm.
You went to mass, you went to communion, and so the Catholic Church gave you that out. What do you think about that, Meg? Or do you?
Well, yeah, well, we had the sacrament of confession. I mean, that's something I just have taken for granted. It was there, and as for me, it's been decades, probably. Well, I think maybe years since I've while I was attempting to go back to the Catholic Church, I did that, but otherwise, I really don't. I mean, it's what Catholics do. It is considered a sacrament, and I think if you're very serious about it and it brings about a change in a person's life, it's a good thing. But if you go and confessing the same thing week after week or month after month, what's the value of it? God gives you grace, but are you using it?
I'll just tell you one last thing and then I won't. Okay, it's somebody else's turn. Okay.
Go ahead, Graciela, because we're
I was
listening.
going to say that I went to confession after many, many years of not going.
Mhm.
And the bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been, I don't know, 20 years or something like that. And Father Tom said to me, Graciela, and I said, I was single, I was married before, I'm divorced. He said to me, Graciela, and it makes me almost want to cry, because he said, you're here today, sitting in front of me and in front of God, sharing your life, and anything you've done, whatever it was, it is cleansed, it is gone. Because you've taken this step and you've made this move. So we spoke very briefly after that. But my point is that and even telling the story makes me maybe feel touched, because the act of confession gives you that kind of, and maybe that's not right, but that kind of feeling of freedom of
Sure.
And
When you're sincere about it, like, yeah, I mean, there is no doubt
Right.
that that sacrament is awesome. When a person is really sincere about what they're doing.
okay. Tim tells me I need to stop talking about this because you've got to talk about the book. So
Well, we are talking about the book, but I want to come back to the question, what's salvation mean to you, Helen?
Well, as you can tell, I'm multitasking, so I've missed out on some of the conversation, but I wanted to back up just a little bit and tell Graciela that I appreciated her comments about the language and the vocabulary, because I'm having real difficulty following her. And it's reassuring to me to hear somebody else is struggling with it too. It does sound very academic to me. And so I have to kind of struggle to get to what she's trying to say.
Yeah, Tim said if you want to read it, you better have a dictionary next to you.
Yes, and a Spanish one too.
Yeah, it is duly academic in Spanish. That's true. It's true.
I don't
salvation,
know if anybody's read Hood Feminism, which is a very secular book, but a lot of what they talk about in that book really echoed to me what she's talking about, in the sense that they talk about mutuality and so many of the things that white feminists talk about. They're missing the things that are important to urban and feminists of color. They're missing things like food insecurity or domestic violence or things like that. And I felt that as I was reading this book. So I don't know, to me, maybe that might be a little bit more accessible to kind of get a different flavor for some of the feminist things that she's talking about.
What's the name of the book again?
It's Hood Feminism.
Quick feminism.
Hood Feminism.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
Kimberly, thanks for what you put in the chat. Salvation is a gift more than something that it's earned. If it's okay, maybe I want to offer a couple other thoughts on salvation that I think she's trying to push us toward. And we all have to decide where we are theologically. But like I said, the definition I was given as a kid that I think operates in the back of our heads is that there's a place of eternal torment and you don't want to go there. So if you don't go there, that's salvation. But, there's some ways that we can play with that a little bit, because I can tell you I've been to hell. It's the lowest point outside of Jerusalem. Like that's what the Bible describes it as. So I've literally been there. And I'm not sure actually that the Bible or our faith picks a place in which God will torture people forever. That just seems really kind of unjust to me. So I think there's other options for salvation. And so there is a white Episcopal preacher, female, Barbara Brown Taylor, who says this interesting phrase: salvation happens anytime someone with a key, so somebody with access, chooses to unlock a door that they could otherwise have locked. So salvation, she says, is about opening doors. The way we talked about it in Lent, if the idea is sin is a burden, salvation is laying down your burden so that you can carry something else, hopefully love or joy. What I think our book talks about is salvation happens anytime alienation is healed, right? Because she talks about sin as alienation, which to me is a really interesting twist, right? So salvation would be when there's reconciliation, and that might require repentance. But I think what she would really say is that salvation is liberation, is about being fully human. So it might mean being comfortable in your own skin. It might be finding God in everyday moments. It might be finding God even in the neighbors that make you upset, right? So I think she would say salvation are those moments, and then acts of salvation are things that enable those moments, i.e. unlocking doors. And this is where people who have any kind of power or privilege use that to lift others up instead of holding their own status quo, if that makes sense. I think she would call that salvation. Now, I do want to tell you, I'm not a Bible scholar in the biggest sense, but I kind of am. And I want to say, when you read the Gospel of John and Jesus talks about eternal life, I think that's what he's got in mind. I don't think Jesus is talking about eternal life as something that happens only after you die. Eternal life in John is a code phrase for larger life now. And it's not just for individuals, it's for communities. And that's where all of these come together about laying down burdens that are just weighing you down, not in a cavalier way, like, I don't care about you, right? And this is where the sacrament of confession is really helpful. It's a way of laying down burden, healing alienation, unlocking doors for other people, because an atheist is somebody who doesn't practice justice. I mean, I think that's where it all sort of comes together. So salvation becomes this really robust word instead of get out of jail free card. So salvation is really about quality of life, both now and later. Eternal life is about a vision for living both now and later, both now and later. I think that's what she's pushing us to consider. And I think that's where alienation becomes really an important word for her, because alienation is not just an idea for her, that's about structural sin. Structural sin alienates people or hierarchalizes people. So I think what she's trying to say is, we grow into salvation when we heal alienation, whether it's men from women, or whites from Latinx, or Catholics from Protestants, or Hindus from Muslims, whatever alienation we're living. When we can reconcile that alienation, then we're coming to liberation and salvation and eternal life.
She's doing this through something called the praxis of the mutuality.
Yes, and this is where I think she does this really well, Tim, in chapter 5, because thinking about everything we've thought about in the last year, this is I think a really wide view about how it is that we start to become aware. And the word she uses, right, is conscientization, which I think she's made up.
Yes.
But she's really saying, like, how is it, and I don't want to overuse this, but how is it that you wake up? Right? How do you become conscious? And the way she tries to say this is through this process of solidarity, mutuality, common interest. And that's where you start to realize, you go from a naive awareness to what she calls a critical awareness, right? So you become aware of oppression, and you also become aware that it is in your common interest to recognize and heal that alienation. It's not just a gift you give somebody else, it benefits you to give the gift. Lila says salvation is accepting the gift of grace and living in joy. Thanks, Lila. I think that she would really appreciate that.
Oh, well, I think salvation has to do with your relationship with others. And as that relationship builds, you find salvation in relationship with others.
I think she would say that, Tim, and the word she uses, I think that's really important, is the word interdependence. And I think what most psychologists would tell you is, you can be independent, you can be codependent, and both of those are unhealthy ways of living, because whether we recognize it or not, we truly are all interdependent. And this is where I really appreciate her use of the word kingdom as a replacement for kingdom, right? We normally settle for a kingdom, and I think she's pushing us beyond that, because there's no word queendom anyway, right? So kingdom is inherently masculine, but it's also inherently this like pyramid scheme of authority and value, where kingdom subverts that, so that the most important people are the ones who push other people up, if that makes sense. Not because anybody is more important, but the people who have power in a kingdom push up the people who cannot lift up themselves. I think that's her image, and that's the image of interdependence. And using your privilege to lift other people up benefits you.
Yes. That's beautiful. I like that.
I really thought chapter 5 was very prescient, given the year we've had nationally, to talk about how do you move from being unaware of your privilege and your fragility to what does it, what's the process to becoming aware, and then not just aware but critical, and where is all this meant to go? So it is very structural, right? It's very, very structural what she does in chapter 5, but I thought it was a really cool process, and it leads her into chapter 6, where she talks about elements of both injustice and what a fullness of justice looks like. And again, she's using the word justice as a synonym for salvation, for faith, and for eternal life, right?
At the end of chapter 5, chapter 5, she talks about the oppressed and the oppressors opening up the dialogue with each other.
Yeah.
I have a little, I don't understand how that happens.
Yeah, that's a really great question. That's a great question, Tim. And I think she tries to say that it comes, frankly, from this process of trying to reach some solidarity. So I think part of that solidarity, or that mutuality or common interest, because she kind of interplays those three, is when people are able to look past all of the breaks to seeing somebody's full humanity. So we have to recognize that people in Haiti that are uneducated and just looking for, to survive the day, that there is something fully human and valuable in those people's lives and thinking process and experience, even if we're predisposed to think that we have all the value that we're going to give to them. And I think we all get that intellectually, but I think integrating that with ourselves is really, really hard. I mean, I have to tell you, I have a really great education. I've got some decent resources. So I do tend to think like I'm the great white hope in a lot of situations. Without thinking I'm the great white hope, I tend to think I'm the one who's able to give the stuff. And, I actually am convinced this is why we take teenagers on mission trips at great expense. We hope that they'll realize that they have much more to receive from interactions from people than they thought they had to get. We hope that. Curiously enough, we have these one-off experiences, and we fail to realize those exist every single day. So I think part of the way we're educated, and maybe I'll just speak for myself, part of the way I was educated is that there are people who are resource rich and resource poor, period. And I think what she's trying to say is dialogue only happens when we recognize that everybody is resourceful. Now, that requires bending my imagination, because I learned a hierarchy of resources. And that's where I live in a kingdom mentality and not a kingdom mentality. So that takes a lot of bending of the mind, and to me, bending of the spirit too. Because the church I was raised in, and she talks about this in chapter 2, also has a hierarchy of persons. They're called deacons, priests, and bishops. And I tell you, when I met the Bishop of San Diego, I was really concerned my piety wasn't good enough, because the bishop had to have better piety than mine. I am now no longer convinced of that. I think his piety is equally as bad as mine. And not just because who he is, because I just, I know lay people who have better piety than all of us. But it's not even about better or worse. It's just what we have.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So how are we going to establish the dialogue between the oppressor and the oppressed?
Well, I think it's going to take a process, right? I think it's going to take not only bending our imagination, but making time not only to hear words, but to listen to them and internalize them, right? And I think that process that I've used different language goes from a naive awareness to a critical awareness. But part of it is giving space. And I will tell you, this happens a lot, and you probably know this. We used to have this lady at a Bible study called Joanne, who was a very, very sharp lady, but she had essentially a form of Parkinson's that made speaking very laborious for her. Often we would ask her a question, and after about 10 seconds of silence, people would just move on because they didn't want to wait anymore. But when we made everybody wait, sometimes it would be 3 minutes. And you'd think, oh, this is so uncomfortable, we just need to go on. She always had something to say. It just literally took her time to gather her words. But the problem was, people were so uncomfortable with the waiting and the silence, they just talked over her. And this is a process I think that we have to be able to engage in, where we wait. And sometimes maybe we don't even have to be in control of the questions. We just need to let the control of the questioning go to people who aren't used to having any control. And that takes a lot of discomfort in waiting. But I don't think, Tim, the way this works, right, is you go to somebody who looks to be in La Lucha and you say, well, you look poor, tell me about, you know what I mean? Like, this is where it's really, really difficult, right? And so I think what she would say is that isn't how families work anyway. The way families work is trust is earned in small moments where you prove, right, that you're a member of the kingdom. And then hopefully as trust accrues, people decide to take risks of trust by expressing to you part of their inner life. And sometimes they don't have the sophistication of language, right? So I will tell you, like, I have a child who is way less articulate than I am, and I can talk circles around him, and I can do that. But then, I mean, at the end of the day, hearing his voice does not sound like mine. He's not able to express himself like I do. And so part of doing this dialogue is recognizing that there is a difference in terms of ability or mode of expression, and then trying to reorient myself around, well, what would it take to actually hear him? And that's hard. And, you know, like, again, I'll tell you, because of my age and education, like, I should have more ability to do that. And when we read Bridges Out of Poverty last year, this is a really interesting bit, right? Bridges Out of Poverty talks about how sometimes we get really, really impatient with people who can't speak our language, instead of realizing there has to be a ramp up, or perhaps people who at the top of the ramp need to slide down the ramp.
That's an interesting statement, because I worked in inner cities, and that was my relationship, or the kids that came to me and their parents. We were speaking. We all spoke Spanish and English, but sometimes it was a different language, Mike. I mean, for me as the educator, as the principal of the school. And I had to adjust how I said things, but yet I didn't want to dumb it down, because we were in school. It was tough. I'm not sure how I got through it, to tell you the truth, but I loved every minute of it.
Well, I think that's part of what the joy of working with children, right? If you open yourself, that, you know, you could say as a teacher, I know everything and I have to give children the ability to know what I know, you will miss out on incredible honesty, curiosity, and creativity. I mean, that's been my own experience, right? I mean, only a child would say, when you say, what's the definition of peace? Only a child will say, that's what you get when you step on a cockroach. I mean, you know, like, no adult is going to say that, because they're too heady. But, you know, like, that is a really interesting thought. Just the spontaneity and the, you know, the pithiness of a phrase like that. And I don't know that you're dumbing anything down to listen to that. There actually is quite a bit of depth to that statement. And I think that's part of, Tim, like what she's encouraging us to do with dialogue, is to say, aha, this may not be my mode of expression, so where's the commonality to be found? Let me ask you another question that Julia put on the table for us, if I might. She says, when she talks about the preferential option for the oppressed, she says something like, only the oppressed are the ones able to conceive of a different reality that has like changes the structure for everybody. And I wanted to know what your thoughts were that. Is that the case? If it is, why is that the case that non-oppressed people cannot imagine?
I don't think that necessarily has to be the case. I think it can be the case. And again, I'm speaking as an educator who worked in inner cities. There were many things about my kids that was different from me in terms of even our day-to-day living. Oh boy, I'm not sure. I remember one time, well, I'm not sure if I can even explain what it was that how I was able to reach them because I was, and but I'm not sure what I did. It's been a while. I'm not sure. I know I loved them a lot. I cared about them, and they knew it. So I don't know, but that's vague.
Well, no, Gracia, I think it's really fair. I mean, the phrase that a lot of teachers throw around is students don't care about how much you know until they know how much you care.
Yes.
And I will say that when I first started teaching high school math, I had a colleague who really was best practice educated. I mean, really, she excelled in best practices. She was a much better teacher than I was, but her students refused to learn from her. And I was not as good at a teacher on paper, but my students tried to learn from me. And I can't quite say what the difference was, except I think they perceived I was willing to try to respect them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Perhaps that's the key to her question is caring.
Yeah, and I think, Tim, I think sometimes it's not even, I think we can naively care without being able to critically care, but I think people know when you're willing to grow in your understanding of what caring for them looks like. And that I find very hopeful. I think the way that we say that in faith language is you don't always have to be willing, but if you're willing to be made willing, then that's all right. If you're not willing to be made willing, then the door is locked. Keisha, it's really
Hey,
good
Mike.
to see you.
From New Hampshire, even.
Thank you.
So I thought the question you asked was actually pretty interesting because it's not when you're oppressed, you have a front seat to want to try and make change, whereas the oppressor may not even understand and, like you said, be willing to institute a change. So just by the fact that you're being oppressed, you're going to try and envision a new future and a new reality. And that whole conversation that has to be had with the oppressor to make the difference, to make the change, has to be a two-way communication because they just can't see it. They don't understand. And what we hear in the media, let's put it that way, is that a lot of people think they have to give up their status, and it's the kingship that you were talking about. That's why I love the analogy of the kinship, because they feel like their status is going to go down in order to raise others up and make them unoppressed. So just my 2 cents.
I think it makes a lot of sense, Keisha. And actually, when I talk to a lot of people who, frankly, like myself, are the top of the food chain because of their gender or their education or skin color, what I find to be a real core variable is whether or not they've ever experienced, even just for a moment, like systemic discrimination.
Yeah.
And I got to tell you, in my own life, I've experienced it only a few times, part because of my denomination, part because I lived with a student visa in Germany. and I did not speak the regional accent, even though I spoke like the high version of German. I was discriminated against because I didn't speak the dialect. I was discriminated against because I went to an American master's program, not to a German one. And one time I got off a bus when I was in Nazareth in the wrong neighborhood, and it was an Arab neighborhood, and I clearly did not belong there. We all knew it. And people followed me and chased me and threw rocks at me. And look, that was like 5 minutes compared to what people have had to do every day in their lives, you know? And so it's interesting that you can have this real short experience, and you can either say, to heck, that's ever going to happen to me again, or you can say, whoa, that was 5 minutes of my life, and some people have to do this every minute of their lives.
Yeah.
And I think part of it, Keisha, is like, particularly, I'm going to say this, I don't want to be offensive, but I think sometimes we just look at our own experience and we say, well, that's never happened to me. So that you must be making that up. Yeah. And this is where a lot of, oddly enough, like some of the people I've found who have the most resistance to women's rights are women. And they say, what are you talking about? I've never been oppressed, without recognizing that they're making 70% of what a man in their position would be making. Or that they have a dress code that is like prone to the fluctuations of the men in power, and they can change their mind anytime, so that a skirt suit is preferred to a dress to a pantsuit. I don't ever have to deal with that. And I never will. If I do, it's because I chose to, but I don't have to do that.
In speaking about the structural part of the oppressed, if we as an oppressor recognize that, and the people and the person, how do we something happened?
Tim, would you say that again? My internet like just acted up, and I didn't get to hear.
If we talking about structural injustice, if we as the oppressor recognize structural injustice, and the people being oppressed don't, how do we establish that dialogue?
Mm-hmm. What does everybody else think? I think that's a great question.
How can oppressed people not realize they are oppressed? They don't have the same, they're not allowed to exercise the same rights. They may be physically disabled in some way. So, and I think everybody wants a better life. And if they don't have it, they wish they did. Of course, there are times I recognize that when they're so involved in everyday survival, they don't have time to think necessarily. But I don't, when somebody puts me down, I notice it.
Ellen?
I think she talked about love back a few chapters, and I think it comes from how we as oppressors approach the oppressed. And if we do it as I care about you, tell me about you, and that kind of thing, instead of what she called charity, giving them things and fixing them, I think maybe that's how we approach it.
I think this is a wonderful question, because this is like the $10 million question I think we're all asking, like, what do we do?
First of all, if you really want to establish a relationship with him, you just respect them. In other words, treat them with respect. Don't start talking to them right away, but get insofar as, changing and stuff, but get to know them as a person and let them begin to learn to trust you so that you can listen to where they are and have time to think about how is the appropriate way to respond to them. But always, like she said, it starts with our relationship with God. And out of that, then we can move forward. And because we'll have the guidance of God's guidance as we go through it also. So I think that first thing we have to do is respect the other person so that they can learn to respect us, and then we can work together.
But I don't know where we're going.
Yeah.
What do you mean? You don't know where we're going.
If you're going to work with the oppressed, don't you have to have some idea of what they need?
See, that I think we have to hear what they're saying.
That's right. You're right.
Yeah, because what we think they need perhaps is not what they need.
Yeah. So that's why you get to know them as individuals, and when y'all can build trust and respect, then they'll tell you eventually.
Can I say, I'm not sure if this makes sense, but because I've worked in inner cities my whole career, and I think, what was it that I did with the kids? Because I was very successful with them. I did care an awful lot about them, and they knew it. It wasn't that they got away with stuff. I don't mean that at all. The rules that were set. If they did the wrong thing, there was consequences. It was an in-house suspension room. There was different levels of consequences. But I remember one day there was a piece of trash on the floor, and I was walking with a kid, and he was a gang kid. He went and picked up the trash and put it in, looked for a trash can, and I said, "Thank you." And he said, "We're not going to live in a trashy school. The school it needs to be clean." And I was almost moved to tears, because this was a gang kid. This was a kid who got himself in trouble, but somehow I think they thought that they were cared about by the people in charge and by the staff. I think, but I'm not sure, Mike. I'm not sure what the answer for that was.
Well, in this one, we might have to hold on to. I put a song lyric in the chat from sort of a folk singer. "It's a strange new world for my generation. I'm just scared we might die from a case of low expectations. It ain't so much people don't want to be happy. It's that everyone's so scared of being sad." And I do wonder if our fear of sadness or pain prevents us from listening to other people. Oh, I'm pretty gross. Yeah, I think I will tell you sometimes, again, like when I was talking about Joanne, who often people did not wait to hear, somehow waiting was painful. And it's so funny, right? Like waiting in silence for a minute was excruciatingly painful for people at the table. And when you think about it, like that's ridiculous. But those are the kinds of things I think that at least keep us there. So part of it may be, Tim, part of the process, right, is saying that pain is really just a signal. Pain is a signal that is telling us to pay attention to something. And we can either choose to pay attention by diverting our attention from it so that it no longer hurts, or by saying, "What are you trying to tell me?" But that, I think, is part of what's going on. Is a lot of times we're so afraid of pain that instead of listening to what it might be trying to tell us, we turn away from it. And I know sometimes when I meet somebody who is oppressed, I have so much presuppositions about what's going on that I don't even actually just listen.
Well, you know, the problem is that we always say, I can fix that.
Well, that definitely is a male perspective. We do tend to be fixers, right? And it drives my wife crazy, and I know better, and I still like to do it because I love solving problems. At the end of the day, look, you made a world better place. Instead
Not
of
a male only thing. Not a
Okay.
male only thing.
it's an engineer thing.
Type
for
A
sure.
females do it too.
Yeah. Well, it's so funny, right? I mean, so often you'll say something and somebody will say like, oh, I would have done it that way too. Or yeah, you did, as if I needed their approval. You know, like it was an opportunity for connection that we turned into validation or to box checking or here's my advice. And that's just the way we sort of grow up, I think. And to think about the theological poverty of behaving that way, we usually think about that as theological strength, but it is the definition of poverty. I want to be mindful of our time. So Tim, I think that's a great question for us to maybe get our heads around a little bit as next week, if that's okay, because I think it really, really matters. And I think it's one of the things that all of the folks I know who are reading books left and right, like this one, to try to understand is really the question we're trying to get at. So what, and where are we going? And what do we practically do to start getting there? I hope you'll enjoy chapters 7 and 8. She's going to give some insight into that a little bit that I hope you'll enjoy, and we'll pick that up next week.
But yeah,
We lost you, Mike.
I'm sorry.
I think it's important for us to figure out how we go into this personally and as a parish.
I think you're right. I think you're right. So let's keep that at the forefront when we read chapters 7 and 8, and let's see if we come up with anything between this week and next, okay? Thank you all. I will see you next week.